Porsche has a long history of building road-busting cars, especially the 1991 models that propelled us to the top-of-the-line GT3. However, if you can't control all that power, the results can be disastrous, leading to a horrendous accident and total car damage. Today, we'll see Simon and his brother Billy fixing a Porsche beast. But first, make sure you're subscribed and let's get started on Porsche. They're currently in Nashville, Tennessee to inspect a new project, a 2022 Porsche GT3. This project looks much better than expected, to the point that the deal appears incredibly ludicrous. They said the deal they're about to finalize is so impressive that it's almost unbelievable. The fact that they're bringing in a trailer and a Sprinter suggests they're indeed serious about buying. This time, they hoped everything would turn out all right, with no scams or problems. They managed to find this particular car through Copart. The model's address was clean, the damage was minimal, and the asking price was $160,000, which wasn't bad at all for a Porsche like this, which was practically in excellent condition. However, they decided they didn't need to push themselves to buy at the advertised price. They thought it would be better to enter an auction and try to reach a maximum of $130,000. But they decided to think it through and do more research, so they went to Facebook Marketplace to see what the prices for this Porsche were in the used car market. That's when the big surprise came. They found the exact same car listed there. At that point, instead of paying Copart around $10,000, which would cover the auction fees and insurance, they decided to contact the seller on Facebook Marketplace directly. This way they can save money and the rest can save money too. In the end, they actually decide that's what they'll do, and they'll try to get the car for $145,000. After calculating the price of the car with unexpected spare parts, they found that the Porsche GT3D might be the cheapest Porsche in all of America, so from the beginning it was a very strong deal. Then they arrived at the location and they said it looked like a car dealership. They saw the owner standing there, looked at the car, and said it looked very nice from the outside. They started walking around the car at their leisure, and at that time he probably gave them the key. They started inspecting the car and said that the most important thing for them was to see if there was any damage to the chassis. Initially, it didn't look like much damage, but there were some parts that appeared to have been removed. They gathered from the beginning that the car needed a fender and some suspension parts. They said it was clear that it had been used on the track, and they saw that it had racing tires. They also noticed that the calipers is not normal, and they looked at the hood and examined it, suspecting it had been repainted. Luckily for them, it turned out to be carbon fiber. Any additions to carbon fiber would certainly be very expensive, and it also had a protective layer of PPF. However, they couldn't figure out how. They found that the roof wasn't carbon fiber, but the doors were aluminum. The rear wing was broken and it hit the rear window, shattering it. They imagined that all the force went to the rear, as if it were a wave of impact. They looked under the car and found it clean underneath. All the damage was to the front. They asked the owner about the car's history, and he said he bought it from someone who had bought it from someone who had been in an accident with it on the track. He said the car came from Florida, and its address or condition indicated that the car was clean and had no accident record, even though the front airbags had deployed and the knee airbag had already been removed. He also told them that the wheel is spinning, but there are broken parts in the suspension, and the radiator and several coolants are damaged. They can't be repaired much because they're leaking water. Then they started the car from inside the interior. The seats are carbon fiber, which looks amazing of course, and the steering wheel is Alcantara. They see on the odometer that the car has 6,000 miles on it, meaning it's practically new or nearly zero. They're also happy that the dashboard is intact. They were worried that even if the brake pads didn't open, the safety fuse might have blown and cut off the electricity. But when they started the car, the engine started normally. They lifted the GT3 and looked underneath. They saw that a part in the front chassis was bent, but based on their assessment, they said that this part wasn't a big deal. However, they also noticed that the oil pan was slightly bent and that all the damage was coming from the front. Finally, they started haggling over the price. At first, the buyer offered them the high price of $160,000, but then they agreed as follows. They initially planned for $145,000, which was the price they actually bought it for. They went back to the workshop and took the car down. They now have a list of initial spare parts, and the price of this set of parts has reached $32,000. This means the price of this car after repair will reach $177,000. They're even giving themselves some leeway in the price, saying it could reach $200,000, at which point they will consider it a very profitable deal, because this car could be sold used in this current condition for $250,000. After taking it apart more, they discovered additional damage to the front chassis, and unfortunately, they had to add about $10,000 worth of spare parts. They said that this part is aluminum and bolted in, but they still need to see if it can be repaired or even replaced. They found rat marks and some wires were eaten away. They put the car on a chassis tensioning machine, measured it, and found that the chassis was moving about an inch, and they started tightening it with the machine until it almost returned to its original position. However, when they released the tension, it started moving again. They noticed a broken support in the front and decided it needed to be replaced first to proceed correctly. They went inside the car and found the leather was dry and slightly worn, concluding that this was due to the brakes. Otherwise, the interior was in excellent condition. So the project is progressing well so far. The car was placed on the chassis machine, and tomorrow they will begin tightening the chassis again. A specialist will come to adjust and correct it. For now, they will focus on the rear section. They ordered some parts from England, and they'll arrive in about a week. During this time, there's some work that needs to be done. They need to see if the rear quarter marker needs replacing. They'll remove the rear section and try to adjust it, but if that doesn't work, they'll probably order a new one from Germany. They'll also try to repair the rear bumper. There was a discussion in the workshop about the wing as the original wing came off on the track. One suggestion was to drive the car without a wing altogether. When they researched this, they found it's called a Davidal wing deletion, and it won't cost much money. Of course, there's the option of buying the original wing or even a more modified one, which is what the car owner wanted. While deciding what to do with the wing, they removed the rim to make sure there's no damage to the chassis and everything seems fine. There are carbon fiber brackets and specially designed air intakes, so they're considering installing cold air tech air intakes to reduce noise and potential damage. The only thing they've found so far is that the rear quarter panel was pushed to one side and broke the glass. This was likely caused by the spoiler being hit, pulling the entire quarter panel with it. They'll continue working and try to salvage this part in general, removing the protective layer and attempting to pull the aluminum back into place. Their colleague from Tuned came and started working on the rear quarter panel. This guy practically spends his time with them on very demanding projects, constantly tapping, and with a few simple taps, the edge returned to its proper position. He confirmed from his experience that this quarter panel can indeed be repaired or salvaged. The gap between the door and the fender is now perfectly aligned, but the door still has a slight imperfection, so they will install a new door. Then they will work on the front panel even without a frame, trying to pull it back. The aluminum needs to be heated to a specific temperature to become malleable because its composition isn't exactly like iron, but it can easily return to its position if the impact was minor after a lot of work. They installed the rear bumper and the alignment was excellent, but there were some strange bulges. The rear quarter panel was probably raised to one side during the impact, so they used a wax pulling tool to pull it forward. They decided to go to a hardware store to buy special tools for the chassis. The owner knew them and was joking around, but he stipulated that they come in a very strong vehicle, so they went in their Dodge Viper. They tried to buy armor plating, but these heavy things are only for official agencies, so they managed to get a transparent plating similar to reinforced plastic, which would help them a little with safety. Afterwards, they returned to the workshop and the rear quarter panel was almost finished. It just needed a light layer of filler and primer and it would look like it was factory installed. Then they started working on the front end. The force they were working with was around 100,000 psi. They removed a broken frame and started tightening the front chassis, but the problem was that the aluminum, it kept springing back after being stretched. So they stretched it an inch more, but it still sprang back. They spent 2 hours working on this. The reason is that aluminum is different from iron, as we mentioned, and everything connected to it is screws or adhesive. So they left it stretched, thinking that maybe it would straighten when it cooled. They kept discussing that when the car was hit, it was very hot in Florida, so the aluminum was very soft at that time and deformed because of the impact, but now it was colder and wouldn't budge, so they decided to heat it up a lot, stretch it, and let it straighten in that position. And indeed, after heating it up, the whole car started to spring back into place. The gaps started to straighten perfectly and the aluminum straightened after stretching. They discovered that aluminum heats up but cools down quickly, which is what makes it lightweight and suitable for racing cars. They finished working on the front chassis and all the measurements were correct. They changed a specific floor because it had become too tight. Then they went back to the rear section and tried to fix the bumper, but it turned out to be too bent, so they decided to order a new one. They installed a new door and a new fender, and their alignment was excellent. So far, the project is progressing very well, but the steps are costing a lot. They're updating the rear quarter panel. The work is progressing piece by piece because this part is very large. They finished the largest part and applied the second layer of filler. They noticed a small crack in the aluminum, and instead of welding it, because welding might make the crack bigger, they cut off the small part and filled it with very strong structural adhesive. They let it dry, and the next day it was holding very well. Now they could continue working on the quarter panel. The shape is now clean, but this part is round and needs a lot of carving and sanding with great patience. The rear quarter panel
panel was primered and it looks almost like the original with the help of their friend and tuned. The work was finished faster. They divided the work between them. One removed the dents. The first mechanic worked on the smaller one and the second one worked on the larger one. They used 5 pumps for specific dents, but the job proved more difficult than they anticipated. They went back to work on the front end, and while they were doing that, a new part arrived that would help start the car and the engine. But before starting, they needed to tighten a section at the front where there was a new bracket. They didn't know the type of aluminum, so they decided to weld it and tighten it. There were 2 brackets for the radiator or main intercooler, but they couldn't find them anywhere, not even at the dealership. However, the old part was still there, so they had to fix it. They worked on it, installed the radiator, and it was very secure. The welding was perfect and the new bracket was attached with its rivet. They would continue by installing the cooling system and the suspension and testing the subframe and assembling all the body parts for a preliminary trial. At that point, the car looked like a completely different Porsche. The front end was clean, the subframe was parked without any problems, and the entire suspension, fenders, and rolling lights looked almost new. They also fixed the hood. It